Today's session is about psychological ownership. So this is a topic that I have written about a lot recently, and it's something that I'm really trying to instill in builders' minds is something that can really differentiate products in our competitive space. So I'll first give a recap of the piece that I published, but ultimately I think this is a topic that is best illustrated with examples, case studies, and discussion on your own. So we're going to walk through some case studies and then do breakout discussions with small groups of founders. So you'll have a chance to meet each other later on. And also I want to make this session really interactive. So feel free to drop questions or comments into the chat throughout. Okay, let's get started. So firstly, just to refresh quickly, what is psychological ownership? It's the feeling of possession or mindness over a product or service. In other words, it's that feeling of emotional attachment that you have over a particular product. It's a concept that actually has been studied very extensively in consumer psychology and consumer marketing. So it's not a term or a concept that I came up with myself, but rather it has a long history in the consumer marketing world. And I really just recently remixed it with crypto. And notably, this sense of attachment over a product or service is actually distinct from whether users legally own something. So people can be legally an owner of something, but not feel much ownership, and vice versa. They can feel a lot of ownership over things that they aren't actually legally owners over. What are some examples of products where users feel a lot of ownership, but may not actually have legal ownership? Feel free to drop in some examples into the chat. Social media. Yes. A playlist. Exactly. Yeah, these are all great examples. I often talk about social media as an example of this, where, users really feel like it's theirs, but it's not legally theirs per the terms of service. And then in terms of the counterexample of cases where users have legal ownership but don't feel a lot of psychological ownership, I often talk about stocks, ETFs, mutual funds, our retirement accounts, things that we probably don't even know what's in there, but we actually do own them. So psychological ownership exists on a spectrum, and there are products that have weaker psychological ownership and those that we have very strong psychological ownership over. Psychological ownership is really important in the consumer product world because it's associated with all of these positive things like increased willingness to pay, greater retention, more word of mouth growth. Users will feel more responsible over the product. They actually feel more satisfied with the product. And in digital communities where people have a high sense of ownership, they actually contribute more and they contribute at higher quality. So the reasons why this happens is also rooted in psychology. There's a lot of behaviors that people exhibit that aren't entirely rational, but have their grounds in consumer psychology. So for instance, there's this thing called the endowment effect, where when people own an object, they actually value it much higher irrationally over its market value. Similarly, loss aversion is this other phenomenon where when people own something, the pain of losing it is actually more powerful than the pleasure of gaining it. There's another cognitive bias called the IKEA effect, where consumers place a disproportionately high value on something that they themselves have partially created in reference to IKEA furniture. And so anyways, all of this is to say that psychological ownership is very deeply rooted in psychology. It's behavior that users exhibit, perhaps not rationally, but it's this very invisible X factor that successful products can leverage. And once you're aware of this dynamic, you kind of see it in all of the products around you. And the good news for builders is that it's not just a fixed quality of products. You can actually do things as a builder to actively cultivate psychological ownership through storytelling, through marketing, or through product design. And we'll talk about how to do that. So why is it important for crypto projects in particular to care about psychological ownership? So I think in crypto, we've introduced crypto ownership or digital asset ownership, which is kind of the digital counterpart to legal contracts enforcing legal ownership. But I think a lot of projects haven't developed the same level of psychological ownership that goes along with that asset ownership. And as mentioned, people aren't just rational beings, they are irrational. And so psychological lever is this lever that you can pull on to engender positive outcomes for your projects. These are a couple of comments that came in response to the piece that I published that I really agree with. I think introducing asset ownership without introducing psychological ownership enables speculation to run rampant. And it also encourages people to join projects or to become holders of projects, not because they actually care about them, but because they're interested in a financial gain, farming an airdrop, or just for earnings. I also think another reason why crypto projects should care about psychological ownership is because asset ownership plus psychological ownership can be a very powerful combination. So we now have this new tool in the toolkit, which is to leverage tokens and to turn users into actual owners. And if we combine that with a sense of attachment, it can mean projects that are much more powerfully retentive, can unseat incumbents, can grow much faster and quicker than the unowned, unuser-owned version could. So before we dive into how to design products that actually engender this feeling of attachment, let's unpack the different drivers of psychological ownership. And I'm going to speed through these because a lot of this was in the essay that you've already read. So I'm going to illustrate it with examples. So there's basically 4 drivers of psychological ownership that are in the literature. There's self-investment, control, intimate knowledge, and self-object congruity. Okay, so self-investment. Who can tell me what self-investment is and why do I have a photo of David Phelps' Twitter in here? Someone could unmute and answer, or they can drop it into the chat. Any takers? I'm going to cold call on people. How about Benny? Benny Chang.
I was just writing a big question for you, Lee. I just sent it in the chat. I don't know what self-investment is, but if I was to guess, it's about investing in yourself.
Close. It's investing yourself into a particular product. So it's about investing time, energy, effort, contributing to projects. Yeah, like basically pouring your heart and soul into a product. And so by doing that,
they call dog fooding a product, or no, different?
I think that's different. Yeah. So self-investment is what users do. Dog fooding is what developers do to test something. But self-investment is basically getting users to contribute effort and energy into a product. And by doing so, they develop a greater sense of loyalty and attachment to it because they've put themselves into it. So I illustrated this with David Phelps because I think he is a Twitter power user. And at this point, Twitter is basically an extension of his identity because he has poured so much blood, sweat, and tears into it. So the next driver is control. This is a driver of that feeling of ownership because if someone can control something, even like physically control it through touch, they are much more likely to feel ownership. And this boost in that feeling of ownership contributes them being willing to pay more for an object, to being much more likely to impulse purchase it and to value it much more highly. You can see this effect in action through different products out there that encourage the sense of control among consumers. So there's a lot of try before you buy products out there that get you to feel control and tactically touch an object in the hopes that you're going to convert to purchase. Even test driving a car has been shown to enhance that feeling of ownership because you picture yourself owning it and then you're much more likely to actually buy the item. In the digital world, this sense of control can also be built in as well. So on the left-hand side, I put an example of a user on TikTok commenting to stay on Swiftie TikTok, aka Taylor Swift TikTok, to affect the algorithm and to customize their own experience. So users on TikTok very much feel like they can control their app experience by doing things like this, by commenting, engaging with videos that they like. And so they have a sense of control over their app experience, and it enhances their feeling of ownership over their own TikTok. They feel like it's their TikTok experience or their algorithm. Another way to help users feel control is by including them in the product feedback process or including them in the co-creation process. I think this ties in well with governance for DAOs. In crypto, governance is one way that users feel control and so deepen their feeling of ownership with projects. There have also been a lot of studies showing that if you include customers very early on in the product development process, if you solicit their input and do user surveys, they feel much more bought in and much more likely to refer other users to it because they feel like a part owner of it. And I think it's interesting in crypto that basically this governance aspect is usually put in place after users actually become owners of an asset. So the governance power is attached to an asset that you own, whereas there's actually, I think, an opportunity to flip that, where people can build an attachment to a product through participating in co-creation and thereby become an asset owner later. So mastery or intimate knowledge is the third driver of psychological ownership. Basically, as users get more information about something, their feelings of ownership increase. In a software example, like after learning all the shortcuts of Superhuman, you feel more bought in, you feel like a pro, you feel like this is your email client that you're going to use. And so it deepens your sense of attachment with it. And in the offline world, we have examples of like people feeling like a restaurant is their local restaurant or their neighborhood park is their park because they had so much intimate knowledge or mastery of that particular thing. I think also, to continue the Superhuman example, I think one of the ways that they've cultivated this intimate knowledge is through their onboarding process. So if you sign up for Superhuman early on, they did this white glove one-on-one onboarding experience that got users up the power learning curve and caused them to develop intimate knowledge and therefore become much more likely to activate and retain and continue to be engaged. Okay, and lastly, we have self-object congruity. Basically, it's a mouthful, but what this means is like alignment with how users see themselves. It's the idea of the product and the self sharing meaningful associations. So the product, the token or whatever, what it stands for, all of its values, its connotations aligns with how users see themselves. And so users gravitate towards brands, towards products that closely match their self-image and their self-concept, whether that's real or aspirational. In the fashion world, you might purchase things that you feel aligns with your self-image. And this also happens in the digital world. So for the Manifold example, I think one of the reasons why Manifold has taken off among creators is not necessarily that the tools are that different from what else is offered out there, but people want to call themselves a Manifold creator because it has associations with serious art. And on the right-hand side, I think Bitcoin is an example of a community that has really high psychological ownership where people really see themselves in the values of the Bitcoin community. Are there other examples of crypto projects where you guys feel like self-object congruity is a key driver of users' sense of attachment with that community?
I think of the Constitution DAO. Like people had a really strong sense of ownership over that DAO because they liked seeing themselves as like owners of democracy or like supporting of democracy. And so I can see that for that DAO.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the fact that people were changing their Twitter handles or Twitter usernames to reflect the Constitution logo or emoji reflected that alignment with their self-concept. Like any project that people are willingly like opting in to change their profiles to basically advertise that project indicates to me that people feel really really aligned with its values, and they feel like it's a reflection of themselves. It's a way to signal their identity. Okay, lots of examples in here. Nouns, agree. Meme coins, definitely for some of them. .eth, I agree with. 40, yes. Noggles as well. Yeah, I think this is like a really big driver of that feeling of attachment in crypto, is this element of self-object congruity. And I think even to some extent, like the way that developers choose what chain to deploy on or which L2 to deploy on, the self-object congruity and that values alignment and what they want to project to the world is at play as a factor as well, beyond just the utilitarian aspects. And so for builders, I think the takeaway here is if you want to tap into this driver, if you want to cultivate that attachment with your users, standing for a clear set of values, making it easy for people to understand what you stand for and to feel alignment with that is pretty key. And that's where storytelling comes in. Okay. So now that we've gone through all of the drivers of psychological ownership, let's talk about how to actually put this into practice as builders. So let's go through some case studies of projects that I think do a good job of creating attachment with their users, and then we can tease out how exactly they did it. And then we'll tie it all into strategies. Okay, so Bright Moments is the first example that I have here. The reason why I included Bright Moments is because it is an NFT that I hold that I feel disproportionate psychological ownership over out of all of the NFTs that I minted. So just to share the backstory of how I got this Bright Moments NFT and what even this is. So Bright Moments is a DAO. They do pop-up in-person live minting sessions at cities all around the world. They've had activations across the US and Europe and Asia recently. And I personally went to London to mint this thing called a Crypto Londoner. And basically the experience was that, well, first of all, I physically flew to London. I made an appointment to go mint my NFT at a certain time and date. I then showed up to the appointment. I was led up to a room with piano music, fresh flowers. I was given champagne. The co-founders were there to greet me in person. And I then live minted this NFT, which I saw through this magnifying glass. They gave me a book. They also gave me sheet music, which was generated to correspond with my NFT. And so I was sent home with all of these things. And yeah, I feel much more attached to this NFT than to a lot of other NFTs that I've just minted through pressing a button on a website. So yeah, I would love to hear from you guys. What are the drivers of psychological ownership you think this experience tapped into? And Maida just dropped in the 4 drivers here into the chat to remind you guys. So self-investment, control, mastery, or alignment with their self-concept. So which of these do you think is at play in this experience? Megan, can you say more about self-investment here?
Yeah, you had to physically book a flight. You took your time and energy to like make an effort to be present to this experience. So that's why I thought of self-investment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. I agree with the control aspect as well. It taps into because it was like a tactile experience and I could actually physically be in the space, see the NFT in person. I felt more in control of the NFT that I got, even though it was just a psychological element. Carson, can you say more about alignment with self-concept?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Lee, I don't really know you that well, but seems like kind of the way you described the event with like the music and the flowers and the location and the people there, I would assume aligned with things that you kind of enjoy, like, okay, very clean experience. I like clean experiences, making everything, like making every part of the experience, like tactile and special with the sheet music and stuff like that, and attaching things that that you might align yourself with, even if they don't have to do anything with the NFT, like makes the memory of the event so much more special than just the NFT itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight. I hadn't even thought of that, but I very much agree with you. I think the NFT does align with my self-concept. I mean, the fact that I opted into going to London, going to this in-person experience, it already showcases that there was some sort of similarity there between the crypto Londoner and me. So I agree with that. Okay, let's keep going through some other case studies. So the next one that I'll talk about is the Shibuya Producer Pass NFT. So these first two examples are for tokens, for projects that are launching tokens in some way. And then the other examples we'll talk about other products that don't necessarily involve tokens, because I know that a lot of builders in the room might not actually be launching tokens. But Shibuya is this community-driven content creation platform with fan-driven funding and fan-driven decision-making of films. So their first film, called White Rabbit, was crowdfunded through a sale of producer pass NFTs like the one that's shown here. And NFT holders get to basically use their NFT to vote on the plot of every subsequent chapter of the film. And so this mechanism gives fans a richer experience of ownership. It's not just an NFT that you own, but it's an NFT that you can use. And as a data point that I think is very interesting, I think they have really high psychological ownership. And I can say that because 80% of the producer pass holders are participating in voting so far, which is really, really high compared to most governance experiences. So users are definitely very active and engaged with the community. And so, yeah, what drivers of psychological ownership do you think this producer pass NFT or Shibuya as a platform is leveraging here? Agree, Kuja. Control, for sure. It's a type of control that's very tangible and real to users. People are able to control the outcome of the film through their NFTs. I think that's the primary one. I think self-investment is there as well. People are investing time, money, energy, creative energy into this experience of the NFT. So very, very much agree. Nikhil, can you say more about alignment with user self-concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if you're getting that kind of flexibility and control to be able to do certain things, you're actually able to shape that in terms of how you kind of see yourself. So any type of like NFT project that allows you to kind of have that type of flexibility and dynamic nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's an element of like you are electing to affect the plot of the film, and so you're naturally choosing a plot path that aligns with your interests, and so I think there is this manifestation of that alignment too. Okay, cool. By the way, great question, Jesse. Can you have self-investment without control? I think something to note, which I hadn't made explicit, is a lot of the drivers are very much overlapping. So a lot of them interplay with each other. Through one, you can get the other. So for instance, in the process of gaining mastery or deep knowledge about something, let's say you get really deep knowledge about your local restaurant, you're also investing your time and effort and energy there too. So those two things I think are really closely coupled. Yeah, I think all of the drivers are interrelated. Okay, let's keep moving. So the next example here is Sound, the music NFT platform. And in particular, this is Cooper Turley's profile on Sound, which is comprised of his music NFTs that he's collected, the artists that he's backed. It also has this badge on the right-hand side to show his ranking of like his leaderboard ranking in terms of his collector behavior on the platform. And when I asked Cooper, how does he feel about this profile? Does he share it? and like how closely aligned with it does he feel, he said, he told me, I share the Coop record profile quite a bit. I think it's a good representation of my music identity, which is a subset of my wider on-chain presence. And so to me, that sounds a lot like self-object congruity, alignment with his self-image. And so basically, by creating this profile that is populated with NFTs that he's picked and chosen, he's assembled this image of this reflection of his on-chain music taste. And so I think this experience deepens his attachment to those particular music NFTs. And it also potentially deepens his attachment to sound as a platform, because sound is then the public profile that he's sharing out to others that he's using to display his identity. One thing that I'll add in terms of, I think, how sound can actually further cement users' attachment with its product is by making this page even more personalizable. Right now, there's limited ability to personalize the sound profile pages. You can set a bio, you can write a small about line, but there's not much beyond that. And so there's limited ability to invest yourself into your profile beyond just purchasing things. I think if users are able to customize their profile pages much more, it will enable people to invest much more deeply into their sound profiles. Okay, I see a lot of questions in chat. Yeah. Okay, agree. By the way, I'll take a pause for questions after these case studies. Okay, PFP projects are a great example of the power of identity signaling in creating user attachment. I think PFPs took off because they took advantage of an existing surface area, which was Twitter, that allowed users to showcase their digital identity. Twitter, for over 300 million users, is already a core part of your identity. And so PFPs were able to piggyback off of that and be really effective in identity signaling and signaling who you were, what your tribe and community membership was, what values you had, because it had this space that it could leverage on an existing social platform. I think it's really notable that other categories of NFTs that are more emergent, like maybe fashion NFTs or podcast NFTs, they don't naturally have this surface area on which users can experience their ownership and identity signal, because there aren't really the display spaces for those NFTs. And so a lot of those emerging NFT projects are actually then having to build their own verticalized products in the hopes that users can then self-identity signal in the context of their own verticalized products. Okay, I'm going to keep moving in the interest of time. So Blackbird is a membership and loyalty platform for the restaurant industry. Users' loyalty to certain merchants is denoted through these NFTs that you collect. And so your NFT has a certain level associated, which gives you certain perks at these merchants. And then every time you check in, you also earn their point system called Fly. So I am the owner of 3 of these Blackbird NFTs at different restaurants in New York City. And one time recently, I actually walked 1.5 miles downtown just to use this membership NFT at Morgenstern's, even though I passed by probably 20 different ice cream shops on the walk there. And the reason why I did that was because I knew that I'd own this thing. I felt a lot of ownership. I wanted to utilize that ownership. And yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts on how does Blackbird engender this feeling of attachment or ownership with its users? Like, which of the drivers are at play here? This one's a little bit more complex. Any thoughts? How about Frankie and Steph? I'm going to call on people.
I think it helps you feel like a little bit more than just a consumer or a customer for a company when you have this added attachment to it. And for the reasons, like you just said, you kind of walked past all of these other places you could have gone to because even though you might not be a regular at this place, you feel like still a step above just a shop because you feel a direct connection to it now.
Right. And I think that really leans into the idea of mastery, the gamification of it, especially where there are levels to be reached as you progress through the New York City foodery scene.
Yeah, I agree with both of those things. I think mastery is at play. I think self-investment is at play. But basically, I think Blackbird has done a really good job of gamifying the experience of developing mastery of these merchants. And so, the fly system, the NFTs, and the fact that they level up, it leads users through the journey of developing intimate knowledge of merchants. And so it on balance, I'm much more inclined to go to a Blackbird partner store because the experience of checking in there and being at the restaurant is gamified and I'm getting rewarded for it. And through that process, I'm also deepening my attachment to the restaurant. And so it kind of feeds, it's like this flywheel that feeds on itself. They're creating more attachment to these merchants through this gamification system. And over time, all of my NFTs collectively, I also feel represent my dining taste and are something that I'm quite proud to showcase as well. So there's also an element of self-object congruity as well. Nikhil, to your question of how does this feel different than something like Foursquare? It's interesting that you asked that because Foursquare is literally my next example in here. So I'll talk about that. Michael, yes, it is a soul-bound token. So these NFTs are non-transferable, at least for the time being. And I think this is another critical element to make me feel more tied and to feel more ownership with Blackbird. They've led with creating emotional attachment to these restaurants and to these NFTs instead of leading with financialization. And so there's a lot of studies about how extrinsic motivation can actually crowd out intrinsic interest. And in this case, they've totally removed the extrinsic factor from the equation. There is no potential for profit. And so really what I'm channeling my energy into is investing in Blackbird, the app, the NFTs, and developing attachment with the merchants without any extrinsic motivation. Okay. And then the last case study that I'll talk through is from the Web2 world. So even without tokens, products are able to garner this feeling of psychological ownership. And I think Foursquare is a really good example. It's this local check-in and discovery app that it looks like a lot of people used to use. I used to use, it got up to 50 million users at one point. And they had a lot of really neat gamification and competitive features inside of the app. For instance, if you checked into a particular spot more than anyone else in the past 60 days, you were crowned mayor of that particular place. And so I was mayor of a bunch of places in Cambridge and New York. And I think this experience created intense attachment to Foursquare and to your profile. And almost irrationally, users wanted to check in everywhere and were very afraid of losing their mayorship. And they had lots of other features like badges and leaderboards. And so the drivers of psychological ownership that I think Foursquare tapped into were personal investment. So you invested a lot of time and energy into Foursquare trying to get these badges and trying to get the mayorship, and that deepened your tie to this app. You also felt mastery and intimate knowledge of the app as well, because through this experience of investing your energy into it, you obviously became a power user. And then there was an aspect of self-object congruity as well, because who was mayor and who had these badges was public. Users could see who was associated with certain spots. And so there was definitely an identity signaling of being known as the mayor of a place or being a power user of the app. And people were proud of that element. Okay, so putting it all together, what are the common strategies in all of these examples? I want to synthesize it for everyone. So the first strategy here is really applicable to projects that have a token or are looking to launch a token, but creating a richer experience of ownership, like the Bright Moments experience or the Shibuya experience of control, can help deepen the tie that users feel to your token versus just treating it like a financial asset. Enabling identity signaling is another strategy. So enabling users to flex their ownership, to signify what they want to about themselves through your product is a good way of creating that sense of ownership. Personalization. So products that are personalizable and customizable, like Twitter or potentially your sound profile, these products through being personalizable, they allow users to invest their time, energy, and effort into it. I think this is a driver that is underexplored in the Web3 product world, by the way. And lastly, gamifying the process of investing energy into a product and the process of gaining mastery is another lever that a lot of these products that I just highlighted utilize. So that gamification can take the form of leveraging points, tokens, or off-chain features like mayorships. But through that gamification, through competition, they create the conditions for users to want to invest more of themselves and their energy into a particular product. And through that process, develop really strong and loyal ties to it. And the last three strategies on this list can be leveraged by all types of products, tokens, apps, even like L1s. And so I think these are strategies that are very broad ranging and apply to all sorts of things that people might be building. Okay, I'll pause there for questions that folks might have. And I'll also take a scan through the chat. Yeah, does anyone have any questions and wants to unmute and ask?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I guess I'm thinking about like potential pitfalls of kind of following some of these strategies maybe before you have like a really strong sense of like product market fit. So like how do you think about like incorporating these things into a product that like you've gotten a reasonable amount of validation on versus maybe falling into some of these things and then potentially getting like false signaling your product's value?
Yeah, I think that creating psychological ownership is definitely not a replacement for getting to product market fit. And like, I think of psychological ownership as more of a lever for retention and continued engagement versus unlocking product market fit. So once products are out there, once they're solving a need that users have, in order to continue to hold on to those users, psychological ownership can be really important, but it's not a band-aid or a fix to a product that lacks product market fit. Okay, going through the chat, I wanted to, let's see, scan through some of the questions in here. So Benny, you had a question about Dunbar's number and psychological ownership. Are there like, basically is the question like, is there a cap of things that we are able to care about? Is that right?
Yeah, essentially. I don't know if you've come across anything like that, but or if it even exists, but yeah, I'm mostly curious about that.
Yeah, I haven't come across anything like that in the studies that I've read, although I wouldn't be surprised if there was a limit. Like there might be a Dunbar's number for things that we own, not just relationships that we have, but I haven't seen any discussion about what that cap is. And I think it's also something that you can build around as like a product builder. Like there are product experiences that you can build to maybe like increase the number of products that you care about and feel ownership over.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Jesse, can you say more about your question?
Yeah, sure. I'm referencing maybe. So my question, just for reference, is how could psychological ownership be relevant for non-consumer facing products? So maybe mainly for like infrastructure companies or dev tooling. I guess like not traditional consumers. So, for example, we're building a compliance layer where our customers may be protocols, for example, projects, maybe traditional institutions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that psychological ownership is probably strongest for like most applicable and relevant to consumer facing products. I think in a B2B context, when you're selling to any sort of business for a SaaS solution or software, like I think those customers tend to be more rational and less like prone to psychology as a lever for driving certain outcomes. Our team, in discussing the topic of psychological ownership, we did discuss how we think psychological ownership is very much a factor that is at play in a lot of like core underlying infrastructure in crypto, where a lot of these ecosystems and communities tap into different drivers of psychological ownership and are able to attract and retain community members because they feel like owners. It's not just a utilitarian calculus, but rather it's the alignment with their values, the fact that they want to identity signal that they're in a particular ecosystem over another. And I think the infrastructure projects that have been most successful have had a lot of clarity over their values and their mission statements, such that users can decide whether or not they resonate with it and whether they want to align their own identity with it.
Lee, can I
Okay.
challenge you just a little bit on the B2B one?
Yeah.
I think that you're right, is that consumer applications likely have, more degree of, likely inherit most of these properties, but I do think that there is some degree of ownership with certain B2B products. I'm thinking like AWS, where there's sort of a high degree of self-investment into learning how to use something like that. Really high switching costs. You have to retrain a team to use a new product if you want to do that, because you've invested so much time. And so you're probably right that these are sort of less common and less prominent, but I think they're still there in some B2B products.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. Sorry, I can't see who's speaking in my Zoom, but whoever that was an awesome example. I very much agree. Yeah, B2B products can engender that kind of like high degree of self-investment and mastery, such that switching costs are even higher. Okay, so there's a lot of questions in here. Maybe I'll just take one more and then we can move into the breakout discussion, or the breakout exercises. So, Carson, do you want to unmute and say your question out loud?
Yeah. So my question was just, do you think financialization hinders psychological ownership? And is the best route with crypto to stick with something soul bound like you did with Blackbird? Or like as you explained with Blackbird? Because I kind of think it does.
Yeah. I think potentially it does. Yeah. And there's been a lot of studies about the interplay of financial incentives with intrinsic motivation to do something. So there's all these studies about like how if you pay little kids to read, they report that they enjoy reading less. And so there does seem to be this crowding out effect where even if someone had enjoyed something before, by introducing a financial component, they are less intrinsically interested in doing that thing. And so in terms of psychological ownership, we're really talking about like, how can we get users to care and to feel attached to a product? And I think by introducing financialization, it potentially creates the risk that you're crowding out that intrinsic desire to use a particular product. That said, I think this topic is really complicated. Another study that I came across was basically around, this was referenced in my essay, it was around stock ownership and the impact that giving users stock in the company would have on their spend at those brands. And so there was a fintech app that ran a study of users where if they were already shoppers at certain brands, they could be rewarded with stock in that brand. And after they became stock owners, their spending at those brands actually jumped by like 40%. And so in that case, financializing the relationship, giving them skin in the game, further enhance their brand loyalty and their propensity to actually shop at those brands. But I think the critical component there was that those users were already emotionally attached to those brands. They were already existing customers. And so they already had a buy-in to the brand. And this was further amplifying that versus simply paying any person on the street in stock and expecting them to then convert to shoppers. Graham, I will have to check. It's referenced at the bottom of my HBR piece, and I'll also send it out in Slack. I can't remember off the top of my head. Okay, I think given the time, we should transition to putting this into practice and talking about some examples of like companies that could benefit from psychological ownership and how to put this into practice for your own project. So there's a couple of case studies that are workshops that I designed. So we're going to be splitting you up into groups. And the first breakout exercise is to discuss in your group a particular crypto project that you think does an effective job at creating psychological ownership. And in your group, you're going to talk about which drivers of psychological ownership does the project tap into. And then also part B is to talk about how it could further amplify users' attachment to their projects. And then I would love for you guys to also introduce yourself in your breakout rooms, because there's founders and there's fellows mixing together, and also appoint a spokesperson to come back and share your learnings at the end of the conversation.